That is so many qualifiers. I had to pause it, man. I was like losing focus. It's like if you haven't played in a while and you have, are thinking about the TV show, and if you have a PS5, and if this, and if that, it's like, all right. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Justin. You've seen the thumbnail and title. We're going to be talking about The Last of Us Part 1 remake, the infamous divisive Last of Us. Maybe it's not that divisive, I don't know. But we're going to be looking at Yongyea's video here and listening to his review. Let's just jump into it, and I'll give my thoughts along the way.
So The Last of Us is a pretty special game for me.
Spoilers. I mean, who doesn't know about Last of Us, right?
It's in my list of top 10 games of all time. I think it set a new bar for character-driven cinematic storytelling in video games, and Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker's performances as Ellie and Joel respectively straight up inspired me to pursue voice acting. It's one of those games that left a mark, an impression on me in ways that few games have done, and none of the things that made the original game special are lost in transition in Naughty Dog's remake, The Last of Us Part 1. And because of that, I don't think I have to tell you about how immaculate the story is, how heartstring-pulling the developing relationship between Joel and Ellie is, how gorgeous, imaginative, atmospheric, and impressive the art direction, the world, visual and audio design, and graphics fidelity are, how masterful the soundtrack is, how visceral and intense the game's stealth and combat sequences can be, and how the wide variety of tools and weapons at your disposal can pave the road to some great tactical action gameplay. We all know how good The Last of Us is, we have known for a while now. But I imagine what you really want to know is how much better is the remake compared to the original? How much have the visuals improved? How much has the gameplay been touched up? How much of an impact do these things have on the overall experience? And is it enough to make the asking price of $70 worth it? Which I'll get to more towards the end.
So right now, before he jumps into it, I'll say I'm one of those people. I don't know. We're going to look at some comments at the end of his video. But I do think the asking price of $70 is a bit too steep. And I already, like I said, I already watched Skill Up's video on this a day or two ago. So I know a lot of features that Yongyea is probably going to already talk about. But $70, probably not. But let's see. Maybe I can be convinced otherwise.
To gauge all of this, the way I approached this review was to play through The Last of Us Part 1 first, and then immediately go back to The Last of Us Remastered to see how different it would look, sound, and feel. I wanted to see how much I'd miss the remake's enhancements. And, well, turns out that as I was playing through Remastered, I ended up missing Part 1's enhancements more than I expected. So let's start with the visuals, the aspect that received the most noticeable facelift. There's just no denying that The Last of Us Part 1 is a far better looking game than The Last of Us Remastered, which is all the more apparent when not looking through the lens of YouTube's compression algorithm. Whereas The Last of Us Remastered overall still looks like an upscaled PlayStation 3 game, a gorgeous one at that, The Last of Us Part 1 looks like a proper cross-generation PS4, PS5 title. It doesn't feel like they just slapped on some new textures and called it a day. The graphics definitely do look remade. You know those projects like Skywind that attempt to rebuild the older Morrowind into the newer and shinier Skyrim engine? That's pretty much what The Last of Us Part 1 is. It's straight up The Last of Us 1 brought into Part 2's engine. Enhanced lighting makes navigating the game's environment.
I want to comment real quick that, because it was floating around in my head, when he said that, YouTube's compression engine, for whatever it's worth, and this probably doesn't come through in the video, but I try to watch some of the videos if they are visually focused in 4K on my monitor, and I'm sitting relatively close / far from the monitor to get an idea what it looks like. But as someone who has, has a PlayStation 5 and has started to play games for, on the PlayStation 5 system, in 4K or in 1080p with high frame rate or whatever the case is, when I do that versus when I watch a video on it, it always looks better when you actually see it in the highest quality that you can. So even something like this, and this isn't even to like defend this video or defend Last of Us, because there's a 0% chance I'm ever going to play this game. But I will say that when people show this side by side, my brain always kind of goes, it doesn't look that much better. but I'm sure that it would, because there's other examples where I actually do play a game in its native resolution, native quality, and I look at it and I'm just like, dang, like the YouTube videos did not do this thing justice. So I want to just get that out there.
Environment's a lot more mesmerizing and atmospheric.
This is us. This is us.
The overhauled foliage makes for a richer looking and feeling post-apocalyptic world. Enhanced models and textures across all objects and characters make for far more modern and realistic visuals. Enhanced particle effects give everything an extra sprinkle of life to surroundings or provide an added sense of visual tension and danger during combat encounters. The enhanced gore from The Last of Us Part 2 is fully intact in Part 1.
Threw that guy into pieces. Just so I can kind of talk over this a little bit more, I'm going to kind of drop the volume a bit. But, you know, one of the criticisms that this game kind of got, I'll pause it. One of the criticisms that this game got was the fact that, like, it was remade so soon. And off the top of my head, and I won't try to, you know, cut this in later in editing or anything like that, but I can't really think of too many games, or really any off the top of my head, where they're quote-unquote a remake and they're so close to the previous game. You know, when you think of something like Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Final Fantasy 7, these are games that, you know, or even like that Ratchet and Clank 2016 version. You think of these games and they're far enough away. They're old PlayStation games, they're old N64 games. I mean, everything on Nintendo kind of looks the same, but you know what I mean? Like, there's games that are old enough that you feel like with modern technology, we can really kind of bring them to life in a way that we couldn't before. So in a way, Last of Us, off the top of my head, kind of stands as the only game where it's so close to the last one. And by last one, I mean, obviously the remastered, that its criticism is kind of like in this weird space, right? Because it's like, well, we still have the PS4 version, but I don't think there's any other game you can really kind of compare it to. It's standing by itself in that regard.
Sense of immersion compared to the original game. The game
turns back up.
performs beautifully too and grants the option between a 40 frames per second fidelity mode and a 60 frames per second performance mode. I went with the latter as I personally couldn't tell enough differences between the two to justify sacrificing some frames, but I do love that they went with a 40 FPS minimum instead of the usual 30.
That's how Ratchet works.
Subtler is how audio design has been tweaked and bolstered across the board, with soundscapes and sound effects feeling richer, better tuned, and with more spatial awareness.
Oh, you know, it's funny. I didn't even notice part 1 was in the top. It just sounded the same, actually.
Last of Us Part 2 applied to the entirety of Last of Us 1, and it's done to great effect. And if continuity is something you care about, Last of Us Part 1's visuals flow right into Part 2 without stark contrast in visual style or fidelity. They even brought things in from Part 2 like the detailed weapon crafting and upgrading animations, or the first-person view of notes and collectibles you pick up throughout the game, none of which were featured in the original.
Whoa, hold on.
So this is where, you know, I'm a little out of my element when it comes to this game because I didn't play it, but I know the gaming cultural impact that Last of Us has had. So this is something, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of features like this that are going to kind of go over my head. But what I am looking for in watching this video is what kind of things that I think is like an outsider almost exist that I think will kind of trigger me to go, oh dang, they really did so much work, or they really put in all this other stuff that, yeah, I do feel like this is worth that $70 price tag. That's really what I'm watching this for.
Characters especially feel a lot more expressive in the remake. The more detailed character models certainly help with that, but you pair that with the overhauled animations, especially where facial animation is concerned, and the end result is characters who look more natural and less stilted in motion than in the original release. Far more expressive nuances come across in the remake, from small muscle twitches to the little things characters' eyes' movements subtly say, to how much more elasticity characters' faces have during bigger moments. Characters just look less like video game 3D models and more like proper humans. Now, the remake's enhancements do result in characters looking a bit different than how you may remember them from the original game. It's fair to say that the art style has shifted a bit from the original Last of Us to Part 2 because the graphics just got way more realistic. Characters are still recognizable, but they definitely don't look exactly the same as they originally did. And Part 1 adopts the character art style of Part 2, and this is one area where I can see some folks arguing whether they prefer the look of a character in the original game over the updated remake version. Tess, for example, is among the characters whose face does look noticeably different, but even Joel and Ellie's appearance have been slightly adjusted.
She looks like way younger. Like, I mean, what do I know about women ages? But like her on the right in the remastered, if I didn't know, and I don't know how old she's supposed to be, but I would say she could be like 26, 27 on the right in the remastered. But the one on the left, she looks like she could be like maybe like late 30s. Which, I mean, on one hand, it doesn't really matter, but with regards to what he was saying about Tess, like, at no point was I just like, I can't tell it's the same character, but like, especially in this shot that I just stopped on, yeah, it's different.
Now, for my part, I've gotten pretty used to the slight visual and stylistic adjustments and overall prefer how much more detailed characters look and move in Part 1. Their moment-to-moment emotions just come across far more prominently and naturally. And unlike in the original Last of Us, cutscenes are not pre-rendered. They happen in-engine in real time, and that makes transitions between cutscene and gameplay way more seamless.
Is it?
Right. Maybe loading screen?
Is it?
And even in-engine, the amount of detail in the cutscenes is just far superior to the original's pre-rendered stuff.
Let me run that back, because that almost was so close to the same thing. So this was remastered. One more time, sorry.
Seamless.
Is it?
That's pretty close. I don't know.
Even in-engine, the amount of detail in the cutscenes is just far superior to the original's pre-rendered stuff. Minutia like drops of tears dripping from a character's nose, or sprays of spit expelling from the mouths of exasperated characters, or flesh and muscle spasms emanating from tense situations make an impactful difference. It's the little things, you know?
Sure.
Some of the cinematography has also been reworked and altered a bit, with certain camera angles being a little different from the original.
Okay.
Now, visual enhancements are given with a remake, but what about gameplay?
Yeah, take that. Oh. Damn. Wow. Oh. Oh, you know, as someone who didn't play this game, I will say, and I guess this is all part one, or the part one stuff, but as someone who didn't play this game, when I did think of Last of Us, or whenever I saw someone kind of playing it, it just looks so brutal. Like, that environment and that world is so grim. And seeing this kind of, you know, just the gameplay just kind of laid bare for you to watch, it looks, oh, visceral. Oh, God, hanging from the tree.
Don't lose him.
Bang.
I'll admit, I went into this review believing that the remake was pretty much going to play exactly like the original Last of Us, but having played Remastered and Part 1 side by side, I can tell you for a fact that they do not feel the same. Everything from the fluidity of movement to aiming and shooting feels more like The Last of Us Part 2. You might think that doesn't make much of a difference, but play Last of Us Part 2 or Part 1 and then immediately try going back to Last of Us Remastered or the original, and you will notice that movement generally feels stiffer and less fluid in Remastered. That animation transitions, like going from walking to running, from running to crouching, or even transitioning into listening mode, feel a bit more rigid. And things like character collision in particular feel pretty jarring and janky with how suddenly it can stop you in your tracks. I actually found myself thinking that The Last of Us Remastered felt a little dated when I went back to it after Part 1. It just didn't feel as good to play. Everything just felt a little clunkier. I'm not saying that Part 1 is a gameplay revolution or that the original is just unplayable by comparison. Everything feels familiar overall, but at the same time the refinements are definitely perceivable. Now, one major missed opportunity was for Part 1 to implement mechanics introduced in Part 2, like going prone or melee dodging. The absence of prone was less of a big deal for me because The Last of Us 1's level design was built around not having prone as a maneuver, but the absence of a dodge button was sorely felt in my opinion. That dodge button made all the difference in enhancing melee combat in Part 2, turning it from a mindless button mashing affair to something that actually required skill and finesse. There were so many instances in Part 1 where I instinctually hit a non-existent dodge button, where I was able to foresee an enemy's melee attack coming, but was unable to move out of the way or do anything about it, and it just feels like such a major omission. Though I will say that melee combat in Part 1 does feel better than Remastered. I could actually switch between targets by pointing the analog stick in the right direction, whereas in the former, you feel more stuck when you engage with an enemy via melee.
I fucking hate these things.
But I ultimately still found melee combat to be pretty mindless feeling in Part 1 as well. It was all about just mashing that square button. But with that said, Last of Us Part 1's moment-to-moment gameplay and combat is definitely not a carbon copy of the original game. Much like how Skywind feels like you're playing Morrowind, but with...
It sounds like he's saying Skywind. Whatever, it's not a big deal. I know what he means, but...
Skyrim's overall gameplay feel, Last of Us Part 1 essentially imports Part 2's improvements, sans certain features like prone and dodging and the like. I also mentioned before that aiming and shooting feels closer to Part 2, with things like weapon sway feeling more reasonable in Part 1, instead of like the aim of a drunk man in Remastered. Shots feel like they have more impact and weight. You have the ability to extensively customize camera sensitivity in a way that was lacking in the original, and more. Even the HUD and the interface for health, ammo count, item crafting, skill upgrades, etc. are all taken from the more refined Part 2. I also previously mentioned how weapon crafting has been changed to look like how it does in Part 2, but even things like powering up generators and opening safes have been adjusted similarly and imported from Part 2. Something else Naughty Dog emphasized in their marketing was improvements to companion and enemy AI, and yeah, I'd say that was noticeable too. Enemies generally felt more threatening and surprised me a few times with some clever flanking maneuvers. Revisiting The Last of Us Remastered, I could definitely tell the AI was noticeably less polished, more erratic, and more unrealistic in their behavior. But with all that said, The Last of Us Part 1 is still, beat for beat, the same game as the original. It's no Final Fantasy VII remake or the Resident Evil remakes. It's not as if The Last of Us is old enough to really need to be a complete remake at that level. Instead, in the spectrum of remakes, I'd say it resides somewhere between Shadow of Colossus remake and Demon's Souls remake, somewhere in between there. Part 1 still features the same story, the same scenarios, the same set pieces, the same encounters, but it's all just refined across the board. Now, that also means that Part 1 does inherit some of the flaws of the original, like an overabundance of puzzles involving moving and placing planks of wood, ladders, and trash dumpsters for navigation, or finding wooden boards to help Ellie cross bodies of water, all of which feel less like engaging or cleverly implemented
water
challenges,
looks really good.
more like tedious and unnecessary filler. Scavenging for resources can still get a bit tedious after a while, but it helps that Part 1 imports Part 2's incredible array of accessibility features and modifiers that were completely absent and remastered, including the ability to toggle auto pickups, which I'd recommend all players turn on. Gunplay, while noticeably better than the original game, does inherit some of the problems I had with it in Part 2. It still does feel a bit too clunky and tanky and inaccurate for my taste compared to other third-person action games, and as I previously brought up, melee combat is still a bit too mindless due to a lack of a dodge mechanic. Combat as a whole does still feel intense, visceral, and often satisfying, with plenty of room for badass and gruesome combat sequences. It's still a very solid combat system, but from time to time, executing moment-to-moment gameplay can still feel a bit cumbersome. And not to mention that Part 1's level and encounter design is mostly unchanged and can feel a bit dated in places, like those areas where cover is set up in a contrived enough way that you're reminded that this is a video game, something that Part 2 fixed with level design that blends far better, more naturally, and more seamlessly with the environment.
Okay.
But none of that ultimately detracts from the fact that The Last of Us is still a masterpiece of a video game from Naughty Dog, but Part 1 is the third time this game has been released. So then the question becomes, is it worth $70? Well, there's no singular objective answer to that. Everyone has a different threshold when it comes to value, but I will say that the Factions multiplayer mode is sorely missing, which for many significantly extended the replay value of what was once a $60 package. To ask people to pay $10 more for what is ultimately a less feature-complete package will understandably turn some folks off. I think sticking with a $50 to $60 price point would have attracted less negative attention on that front, though they do package in some extra goodies you can unlock after finishing the campaign to try to sweeten the deal a little bit, like a model viewer akin to what you find in The Last of Us Part 2, various skins for Ellie and Joel and their myriad weapons,
Jack and Daxter.
a wide array of visual filters that either give the game a different vibe or make the game downright unplayable and likely more intended for photo mode. There's a mirrored mode you can turn on as well if you want to do another playthrough that way.
So it's something I kind of heard in SkillUp's video, and I feel like, you know, depending on how many videos I put out, this might sound a little bit like a repeat. So this might be one of the last times I say this, which is what I felt when I was playing Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, which is companies probably put $70 worth of time into the game, like when they're making it. But are you getting $70 value out of it as the consumer? And I don't think I've said this in other videos, so I'll kind of bring up an example to me that really sticks out, which is Monster Hunter World. I mean, there's a number of different games I could go with, but for me, Monster Hunter World really sticks out as something that costs $60. And I think by the time I was playing the end of Iceborne, which I get was a paid expansion, but at some point while I was playing Iceborne, I was thinking, you know, I got so much money out of this. They could have like retroactively been like, yo, give me an extra $50, and I'd have been like, okay, maybe not 50, but you know what I mean. Like, they put in so much value for the 60 that it made me go, well, yeah, I'm totally be up for like paying $60 for this game, or even an extra 20 for the expansion, or whatever it is. And so what I think that, you know, you remove the multiplayer mode and you have something like this come in here with all the different modes. I don't know if he's going to talk about it. I'm sure he will, but like the commentary mode that I heard SkillUp talk about, where you play through the game once and then you can get the commentary from Troy Baker and Neil Druckmann as far as like what was going on in cutscenes, you know. So yeah, I think that it's something that it's very nuanced when it comes to this statement, but I do think that they probably put $70 worth of content in the game, like they felt that they did, but it's just a matter of, do consumers feel like that price tag is worth everything that was put in?
There's a comprehensive speedrun mode to properly track completion time across the game's various sections and your best times as well, various cheat codes and gameplay modifiers to add some twists or power fantasies for your next playthrough, and more. Part 1 also includes the incredible array of industry-leading accessibility features from Part 2, which will allow people with disabilities to play the game more comfortably, and things like extensive difficulty adjustment sliders mean that you can tailor and customize the experience in depth to your exact needs and specifications. All of these features in combination with a substantial visual overhaul and the noticeable gameplay improvements certainly do add value to the package. The effort put into Part 1 definitely does not feel like a lazy cash grab or something they phoned in. You can tell they put a lot of love and effort into this one, and it's overall a very polished game at that. I only really encountered one noteworthy bug involving Joel getting stuck mid-animation, unable to move in the water as the game tried to snap the wooden board Ellie was standing on onto the platform where she's supposed to get off. But the game's generous checkpoint system and quick loading times made it very easy to just restart from the last checkpoint and quickly try again. That one instance aside, it was just smooth sailing from a technical standpoint. Now, even with the enhancements and some of the extra goodies that are included in Part 1, it can still certainly be argued that this is a package that's ultimately not as complete as past releases of The Last of Us, and one that is not an entirely new experience either. So if you've already played this game numerous times before and haven't been itching for a third replay, then spending $70 on Part 1 is probably not for you. The enhancements are fantastic and make for a smoother looking, smoother feeling, more atmospheric, more visually appealing, and noticeably better playing game, but they don't completely revolutionize the experience. Now, if it's been some time since you played The Last of Us and have been itching to replay it, and if you want to experience the definitive and absolute best version of the game both from a visual and gameplay standpoint with enhancements that make enough of an impact on the overall experience and you aren't too attached to the faction's multiplayer mode.
That is so many qualifiers. I had to pause it, man. I was like losing focus. It's like, if you haven't played in a while and you have, are thinking about the TV show, and if you have a PS5, and if this, and if that, it's like, all right, like, if you have to add that many qualifiers to it, it's probably, I'm sure the developers had to have thought of that too. What was also going through my head, and there's another minute and a half left in this video, was something that I heard on SkillUp's video, and it totally makes sense when I heard it, which was with the HBO series coming out for Last of Us, it's probably PlayStation and Sony trying to capitalize on what happened with the Witcher series. How when the Witcher series really took off on Netflix, the game Witcher 3 went up in sales. I think all of the Witcher games went up in sales, but Witcher 3 in particular, was one that people started jumping into because it was the most recent game, and people knew it was the highest quality one that was out there. So maybe PlayStation is thinking about that. Maybe they're thinking, well, if our Last of Us TV show is successful on HBO and people are really talking about it, they might, because there's going to be at some point in the show where they're going to say, as far as like a promotional thing, like based on the hit video game of the same name, Last of Us. And so people might go look it up. And when they type in Last of Us and they see this game as the first thing that pops up, it sounds weird to say it this way, but I don't think anybody who's coming in from the TV world, watching the show would think, why is this $70? The only people really having that conversation are people kind of dialed into the gaming industry. I don't think anybody that sees in this scenario, right? You watch Last of Us, the show, and you have no idea it's a video game. Here's now me doing qualifiers, because not only would you have to not know it's a video game, but you'd also need a PS5. So assuming those two things were true, you didn't know that this video game ever existed, this series or franchise, and you had a PlayStation 5, and you really like the show, kind of like a third qualifier, then here's the game for you. But if you're someone that maybe has a PS4 and then you see, the show and you're like, well, it's really good, and then you go to the PlayStation store and you see the game, whatever, you know what I mean? So I'd be curious to know what the reception looks like. I mean, on one hand, I know that I kind of like to see chaos happen on the internet. My prediction, and I'm never right about these things, so who knows, maybe I'm jinxing it, but my prediction is that it's just going to be another thing. Like, I think the game is going to come out, people are going to stream and play it. I think the show is going to come out and people are going to talk about it, but I don't think it's going to do like anything like it did with The Witcher. I think it's different audiences, and I think it's different reach. So
then you won't be disappointed with this remake, which strikes a great balance of retaining the core experience while improving and modernizing many key elements. Last but not least, if you've never played The Last of Us, do yourself a favor and experience this video game, and the remake is the version you should get. There's just no better time to dive into the game for the first time. if you happen to be among the lucky few who found and own a PlayStation 5, that is.
Yeah.
Potential qualms surrounding pricing model and value aside, as far as remakes go, I've got to say honestly, this is a damn good one. One that serves to further accentuate what a special game The Last of Us is.
So, is everything you were hoping for?
It's got its ups and downs, but you can't deny the view, though.
Okay, that was solid video. On the last note that he made, I haven't played Last of Us, but I know what happens, and I've known for a very long time the major beats of the game. I'm good. I'm not going to play it, but before we get out of here, before we end this video, let's check out some YouTube comments. Let's see what people are kind of saying about Yongyea's thoughts here. In agreement with a lot of the comments here, it's a good-looking remake, but charging full price. That's a no for me, dog. The remaster still holds up really well. It does. I mean, maybe it's one of those things where you got to see it to believe it, but like I commented a bit earlier, there are games that I've seen on YouTube and then I've seen like in person, right? Like when I'm playing the game myself. Even Astro's Playroom, I think is the name of the game, on the PS5. Like I watched people play that game before I got a PS5, and I was like, okay, it looks like Astro. Like, what do you want from me? And then I played it, and I was just like, okay, this like is next level. So I agree with that point, but not everybody can get this game. So as much as I love the game, I'm not paying full price for a remake that has part of the game removed. Okay. I'm happy to see a lot of people here are willing to wait for it to come down in price or straight up not willing to buy it, since most of us have already played it twice. Even though a lot of the quality of life improvement has been added, I still think this game price should be around $50. I guess I'll comment on that, right? Cool, just not $7. I don't necessarily know if I could throw a dollar amount at this. I mean, I have to defer to people who've played it or people who are kind of in that realm more so than me. I don't know if there's a single PlayStation 5 game that is worth $70 to me. And I've played a handful of them. I've played a little bit of Returnal. I've played or seen a little bit more of Returnal. I've played Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and I saw Demon's Souls. And I just, like, at no point was I ever thinking in any of those instances, like, dang, this is well worth $70. Like, it hasn't happened yet. And I know I've gone to other I've made those comments in other videos with regards to like why I think that's the case, so I won't rehash it here. But as far as what I think a price would be as like an outsider, like if I were to see it for myself, let's look at it this way. If I were to see the game on the PlayStation Store and I go, oh crap, Last of Us Part 1, that's right. And I saw it, if it was like 50, yeah. I mean, I can't really say because of the multiplayer. I just think from the sheer standpoint that this game has come, that this is technically a PlayStation 3 game, which is the argument that I made for Demon's Souls. I don't think Demon's Souls is worth $70 either because it's a PS3 game. I don't care how good looking it is, because by it being $70 and it being a PS5 game, what you're saying, no matter what, is that the value is in what it looks like. That's what you're saying, and it shouldn't be. It's a video game. I don't think the value of the video game should be what it looks like. I think it should be not just what it looks like, but the package of how it plays as well. So I think that in this example, maybe depending on who you are, $70 is worth it. If I hadn't played Last of Us and I didn't know spoilers for Last of Us 1 and 2, I would probably think, $50 would be fine. I'll never forget just sitting and staring at my TV, jaw wide open in silence after playing through that opening. Just one jaw-dropping moment to the next. Such a masterpiece. Yep, we've all heard about that one. I remember my buddy told me about that opening, and I saw it before it cuts to the title screen of Last of Us when Joel's daughter dies. Spoiler. I remember when I saw that, I was just like, whoa, that's heavy. It wasn't enough to get me to play the game, though. I was just like, dang, man, tell me when you finish it. Graphically, the game looks great, and I will pick it up at some point. Definitely going to wait for a sale. Okay. This isn't a lazy cash grab. I want to try to find some ones where people are like in full support. This isn't a lazy cash grab. It's a cash grab that took moderate effort. Damn. It's kind of brutal. I'm trying to look for some. I'm gonna see if I can find one. I'm gonna close out the video after this. I want to see if I can find one where somebody's just hardcore, like, yeah, I don't care if it was $100, I'm all in. Not, I mean, I don't have all day to look through all these comments. And I've seen Twitter comments. I mean, we've all seen it. I think at this point, the consensus is that for people who already know what this is, it's probably not worth $70 right now. So I think what it's really going to kind of come down to is, are we going to get like a FIFA, Madden, situation where the people who aren't leaving comments and really voicing their opinion online, are they going to just in droves purchase this game and boost it up to the extent that like it's a bestseller? Or are we gonna have to wait for the HBO TV series to come out, and then maybe those people who are unfamiliar with it will kind of jump in. I think unlike The Witcher in that example where, people saw the TV series and then went and bought the books and then went and bought the game to experience more of that universe, it's a bit different because, one, I think The Witcher series, I could be wrong on this, but I think that because it was Netflix, I think it all dropped at once, so people could just binge the whole show and then they went and got the books and the game. With HBO, they're probably going to be releasing it weekly. And if people don't have the ability to get a PlayStation 5 to then spend $70 on this game, I don't know. I just don't think that it will do the same numbers. But that's it. Those are my thoughts. If you want to check out more of my content, I live stream games on Twitch, or you can check out my other reaction commentary videos I've done on my channel. Until next time, peace.